On the 19th of May, 1943, a man died alone in a boarding house room at 304 Montague Road, West End, Brisbane. The police who attended noted his possessions: a miner's hut worth approximately £20 on a claim at Miclair, 5 shillings found beside him in the room, and £6 owed to him in wages by employers who had not yet paid. His medals were not there. The newspapers ran a brief item the following day that occupied a few column inches. The headline read, "Crack Sniper Dies Here." What that headline did not say was that the man in that room had killed more enemy soldiers with a single rifle than almost any other soldier in the history of the Australian Imperial Force, that a general commanding an entire corps had personally taken a turn at spotting for him so he could watch the marksmanship firsthand, that the same general subsequently told Lord Kitchener that if his troops could match the capacity of this one man, the Allied forces would soon be in Constantinople. Tell me in the comments, had you heard the name Billy Singh before today? Because what you are about to discover will make you question who a country chooses to remember and who it decides to leave in an unmarked grave for 50 years. Now let's go. To understand how a man ends with 5 shillings and no medals in a Brisbane boarding house, you must first understand what kind of country produced him and what that country had decided, in law and in practice, he was worth. The Australia into which William Edward Singh was born on the 2nd of March, 1886, was a country that had been working for several decades to answer a question about itself, and the answer it had settled on was written into its statutes with the confidence of people who believed the question had been definitively resolved. The White Australia policy was not a social attitude, it was legislation. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1901 encoded it at the federal level. The 1909 Defence Act went further, specifically exempting people not substantially of European origin or descent from military service. Not an informal understanding between gentlemen. The law of the land. Billy Singh's father had arrived in that land in 1861 from Shanghai. John Singh had come during the Queensland Gold Rush, one of thousands of Chinese men who crossed the Pacific in the 19th century, looking for what everyone else was looking for in the colonial goldfields. When the ore ran thin and other Chinese miners moved on to new discoveries at Rockhampton, John Singh stayed. He built a life in the Claremont district as a drover and later a market gardener, with the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided that a place is his, regardless of what the place thinks about it. On the 4th of July, 1883, he married Mary Ann Pugh, a nurse from Kingswinford in Staffordshire, England. Their son Billy was born on a grazing property outside Claremont, known as the Western, in March of 1886. The world Billy grew up in was one of, as the historical record puts it, with characteristic restraint, considerable anti-Chinese feeling. In practical terms, that restraint describes a boy of Chinese and English ancestry in rural Queensland who found the more desirable forms of employment unavailable to him, social inclusion conditional on things he could not change, and the country whose soil he had been born in extending to him a qualified, contingent welcome that could be withdrawn at any time. He hauled timber, he cut sugarcane, he mustered cattle, he worked the jobs available to men at the lower end of the labor market in country Queensland, which was not, in that era, a category that offered much. What the countryside gave him without reservation was the education of the Queensland bush. By the time he was 10, he could track animals through the scrub, sleep outdoors, cook over an open fire, and fire a rifle with an accuracy that impressed everyone who watched him do it. He refined that accuracy by shooting the tails off piglets at 25 paces. He joined the Proserpine Rifle Club after moving there in 1910. He worked as a professional kangaroo shooter, a trade that rewarded consistent lethality with the same impassive precision that the Gallipoli War Diary would later use to count his kills. The patience the Queensland bush required of a man waiting for an animal to move into a clearing, the stillness, the suppression of everything that would give away a position, all of it was accumulating in Billy Singh, without anyone understanding what it was accumulating toward. On the 24th of October, 1914, 2 months and 26 days after Britain declared war on Germany, and Australia automatically followed, Billy Singh enlisted at Bowen, Queensland. He was 28 years old. He listed his occupation as horse driver. The recruitment officer who processed his papers did not enforce the Defence Act's exclusion of men not substantially of European descent. Whether this was oversight, sympathetic discretion, or the inconsistent application that characterized recruiting standards in the war's early weeks is not recorded. What is recorded is that Billy Singh was accepted into the 5th Light Horse Regiment, and that 5 days before Christmas, 1914, the regiment sailed for Egypt. He left behind the Queensland dust and the Rifle Club, and sailed toward a war that would make him famous across 3 countries' newspapers, and, in the end, give him back to a patch of ground in Brisbane, not far from where he had started. The men of the 5th Light Horse spent April of 1915 in Egypt. They trained in the desert, their horses beside them, because they were cavalrymen, and because nobody had yet told them that the peninsula across the Mediterranean would have no use for cavalry, and every conceivable use for men who could wait without moving. On the 25th of April, 1915, 16,000 Australians and New Zealanders, alongside British, French, and Indian troops, landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The Light Horse watched from the desert while the infantry created Australian history on a strip of Turkish coastline most of them had never heard of 3 months earlier. Gallipoli was, as biographer John Hamilton would later write, a country made for snipers. The terrain had been shaped by geology into something that functioned almost as a purpose-built killing ground for men who understood concealment. Steep ridges ran diagonally from the coast. Deep gullies cut between them in formations that appeared random and were, to men navigating them for the first time under fire, comprehensively disorienting. Thick thorn scrub covered the slopes, providing cover that Turkish defenders had learned across their lifetimes, and that the Anzac attackers were encountering on the morning they tried to advance through it. The bridgehead was compressed from the beginning into roughly 1.5 kilometers of depth at its broadest, close enough that Turkish positions commanded not just the front trenches, but the supply routes, the beach itself, and anything that moved in between. Senior officers were killed by Turkish snipers while still waiting ashore on the 25th of April. The attrition of command rank personnel by concealed shooters was, from the first hours of the campaign, a defining and continuous feature of what it meant to be there. The rising casualty toll produced the decision the Light Horse had been waiting for. The horses would stay in Egypt. The men would go as infantry. The 5th Light Horse Regiment embarked for the Dardanelles on the 16th of May, 1915. Billy Singh arrived on a peninsula where everything he had trained for as a cavalryman was irrelevant, and where the one skill he had acquired without instruction, the ability to remain motionless in concealment for hours, waiting for the precise moment, was worth more than anything else he could offer. For the first month after landing, Light Horse men were distributed among infantry battalions for orientation. By mid-June, they had regrouped, and the 5th Light Horse was positioned on the seaward side of Bolton's Ridge. The position had been named Chatham's Post, in honor of a young English-born Light Horse officer. From it, Turkish lines were visible at ranges between 40 and 400 meters. It was here, this specific patch of ridgeline in the early summer of 1915, that Billy Singh picked up his standard-issue short magazine Lee Enfield, chambered in .303 British, fitted with iron sights and nothing else, and began. The daily routine at Chatham's post had no dramatic beginning. Before dawn, while it was still dark enough that movement across the ridge would not be visible to Turkish observers, Singh would move into his position, his posse in the Australian vernacular, a carefully chosen, camouflaged spot with a clear field of fire over the enemy lines. In place before first light, because first light was when careless men made themselves visible, and careless men were what the sniper was waiting for. He would not move again until after nightfall. Between those 2 points of darkness, he remained as still as the terrain itself, with a spotter beside him, usually Ion Idries or Tom Sheehan, scanning the Turkish positions through a telescope or periscope, protecting both men from the exposure that a visible human head above the parapet would invite. Much of the shooting at Gallipoli was done through loopholes, small apertures cut into the walls of trenches or constructed hides, aimed frequently at the corresponding loopholes of the enemy's own positions. Not the sniper of the cinema, ranging freely through open ground. A patient, technically demanding, genuinely dangerous form of work, conducted at ranges where a mistake in either direction meant immediate death. The man who hit through a loophole had to know his rifle, his ammunition, his angle, and the exact location of the target aperture with a precision that left nothing to estimation. The man who missed drew fire. Ion Idries sailed to the war on the same ship as Singh and was himself an experienced Queensland bushman. He frequently served as Singh's spotter in the campaign's early months, and his description of the man beside him in that hide became the most quoted physical account in the historical record. A little chap, very dark, with a jet-black mustache and a goatee beard. A picturesque-looking man-killer. He is the crack sniper of the Anzacs. The word man-killer carries no qualification in Idries's account. Offered as a straightforward description, with the admiration of one competent bushman, for another demonstrating his competence in the most consequential environment imaginable. Tom Sheehan was the other primary spotter, less documented in the literary record, but equally essential to the operational reality of what Singh was doing. The spotter's function was to extend the sniper's awareness beyond what one man's eyes could cover, to observe terrain, identify movement, calculate angles, and direct the rifle toward targets the sniper had not yet acquired. The partnership between Singh and his spotters was one of enforced proximity and accumulated trust, hours of shared absolute stillness, the common knowledge that any sound or movement could identify the position to the men on the other side of the dirt, who were, with equal patience and equal skill, trying to find them. On productive days, Singh's tally reached 9 kills, not in an assault, not in an artillery barrage, through the deliberate, individual, verified act of precision with a standard-issue rifle from a concealed position, against targets who appeared one at a time in the narrow windows of visibility that terrain and fortification permitted. 9 people in a single day. The weight of that number requires a moment's acknowledgement before the narrative continues. Each kill required independent verification, an observer, frequently an officer, confirming through a telescope that the shot had struck and the target had fallen. This was not informal accounting. The Anzac War Diary entry for the 23rd of October, 1915, states plainly, "Our premier sniper, Trooper Singh, 2nd LH, yesterday accounted for his 199th Turk." Every one of this record is vouched for by an independent observer, frequently an officer who observes through a telescope. A separate notation in the Australian War Memorial records makes a point that is easy to miss. These casualties were apart from those he inflicted when he had no observers. The documented figure was, by the Army's own acknowledgement, an undercount. How far under Major Stephen Midgley of the 5th Light Horse, the officer closest to Singh's work and best placed to assess its full scope, estimated it close to 300. Word of the growing tally moved along the Anzac trenches like a cricket score, not announced by command, but passed mouth to mouth, position to position, as a daily dispatch from a private war within the larger one. It functioned as a morale instrument, and the Army understood this well enough that the passing of the number was, if not officially encouraged, then officially permitted. Each day's addition to the count was proof that the Turkish snipers, who had been killing Anzac officers on the beach in April, could be answered. Someone on the Anzac side was winning the personal war that the overall campaign was conspicuously failing to win. Private Frank Reed, a fellow Australian soldier, wrote in 1916, while the war was still being fought, an account that stands as the closest thing the historical record possesses to a character testimony from a peer. Every time Billy Singh felt sorry for the poor Turks, he remembered how their snipers picked off the Australian officers in the early days of the landing, and he hardened his heart. But he never fired at a stretcher bearer or any of the soldiers who were trying to rescue wounded Turks. Reed's account is contemporaneous, which gives it a weight that retrospective testimony cannot match. It describes a man with a moral accounting of his own work, a justification constructed from what Turkish snipers had done in April, maintained as a daily act of will against whatever it would otherwise have felt like to be doing what he was doing. It also describes a line. John Hamilton, the biographer, offers a contrasting anecdote from a different source, that after spotting an injured Turk in the open, Singh said he would put that poor cuss out of his agony, and did. The two accounts are not incompatible. They describe the same man in different moments, making different calculations under different pressures. The narrative presents both without adjudicating between them. General Birdwood, commanding the Anzac Corps, received reports of the tally from Midgley and asked on one occasion to take a turn as Singh's spotter so he could observe the marksmanship firsthand. The Corps commander in a forward position, with a telescope, acting as observer for a trooper. This reversal of the usual order of things did not go unremarked. What Birdwood subsequently told Lord Kitchener entered the record through the accounts of those who heard it. If his troops could match the capacity of the Queensland sniper, the Allied forces would soon be in Constantinople. One trooper, a standard rifle, iron sights, in the Corps commander's assessment, worth more than the strategic arithmetic of the campaign, if only the capacity could be multiplied. The Turkish command had its own analysts. What distinguished Singh's sniping from the work of other Anzac marksmen was, it appears, specific enough to be identifiable through study. The angle of entry wounds, the consistency of ranges, the pattern of who died and where they were standing when the shot arrived. Turkish military intelligence concluded that one man was responsible for a disproportionate share of casualties in the Chatham's Post area, and that the characteristics of the shooting were distinct enough to be worth a specialist response. They brought in their own champion marksman. The name by which he became known to the Anzac forces was Abdul the Terrible. His real name is not in the historical record. He was a decorated shot, assigned one mission. Abdul approached the problem with the same methodical patience Singh had applied to his own work across the preceding months. He studied the victims, examining entry wounds, calculating trajectories, building through analysis a picture of where the shots were originating. His conclusion was that Singh operated from Chatham's Post. At night, to avoid detection, he dug a concealed foxhole, working forward over multiple days, closing the distance to a position from which he could observe the Anzac sniper's location and engage. The Turkish command reportedly passed only those incidents believed to be Singh's work to Abdul. Not Anzac sniping as a general category, but one specific man. The confrontation, when it came, arrived without announcement. Singh's spotter directed the rifle toward what appeared to be a target. Singh looked through his sights and found himself looking directly into the face of another man, looking back at him through his own. Both had identified each other at the same moment. Singh fired first. Abdul was killed. Turkish artillery opened on Chatham's post within seconds, not as a delayed response, but as a coordinated action, as though the gunners had been waiting with their registers already laid on the position. The post was saturated with shells and destroyed. Singh and his spotter had seconds to reach the unit trenches. They made it. Ion Idris did not publish his account of this confrontation until 1942, 27 years after the events he described. The delay cast some shadow over the precise dramatic details, the simultaneous identification across the sites, the mutual recognition in the fraction of a second before one man fired. What sits beyond dispute is that Abdul was deployed specifically to eliminate Singh, that Singh survived and Abdul did not, and that the artillery's immediate and coordinated response confirms the confrontation had been anticipated and prepared for by the Turkish side. The duel may or may not have unfolded exactly as Idris rendered it. The outcome did. The cleaner record belongs to a separate incident in August of 1915. A Turkish marksman, whether Abdul himself or another shooter working the same approaches, fired a single bullet that passed through Tom Sheehan's spotting telescope, through his hands, his mouth, and his cheek, and came to rest in Singh's shoulder. One bullet. That sequence, telescope, hands, mouth, cheek, shoulder, is the record of what a single shot accomplished in the space it crossed before stopping. Sheehan was severely wounded and shipped back to Australia. Singh was hospitalized for 4 days and back in position within a week. The instrument that had extended his range had nearly killed him through it. The Gallipoli campaign arrived at its conclusion without achieving any of the strategic objectives it had been designed to produce. Approximately 44,000 Allied troops and 85,000 Turkish soldiers died in 8 months of fighting for a bridgehead that had not meaningfully advanced from its April 1915 position. The evacuation, conducted in total secrecy over multiple nights in December of that year, was executed without a single casualty, which was either a remarkable operational achievement or a devastating commentary on how differently the campaign might have been managed from the beginning. Billy Singh did not participate in the withdrawal. Illness had overtaken him in the campaign's final weeks, and he had been evacuated to Malta. He returned to Egypt, where he was hospitalized again with mumps. In February of 1916, General Sir Ian Hamilton mentioned him in dispatches. On the 10th of March, 1916, the Distinguished Conduct Medal was formally awarded. The citation read, "Conspicuous gallantry from May to September 1915 at Anzac as a sniper." His courage and skill were most marked, and he was responsible for a very large number of casualties among the enemy, no risk being too great for him to take. The phrase "very large number" occupied the space where the actual figure, 201 officially verified, probably 300 in reality, might have appeared, and chose not to. The Army's characteristic verbal habit, precise in every administrative detail, imprecise precisely when precision would have been most revealing. In July of 1916, Singh was transferred to the 31st Infantry Battalion. In December of that year, he departed for France. He arrived in January of 1917 and wrote home about the conditions. "We had an awful time in France this winter," the letter reported. "It was the coldest they'd had for years." This fragment is among the very few pieces of first-person testimony that survive in the accessible historical record from a man who left almost no personal written trace. Its ordinariness is what distinguishes it. The man whom the Corps commander had described to a cabinet minister as the standard by which an army should measure itself was writing home about the temperature. The Western Front operated according to entirely different logic than Gallipoli had imposed. Artillery dominated the tactical landscape in ways the Peninsula Campaign had not approached, not targeted counter-battery fire, but sustained bombardments of entire grid squares that turned the ground itself into something that could not support a man's weight. Mustard gas collected in the low places. The scale of the theater and the density of the industrial killing it had developed across 2 years of warfare, reduced the opportunities for individual precision. Singh was not without use. He was not the same kind of weapon. In March of 1917, a bullet struck him in the leg. He was hospitalized in England, his second wound. While convalescing, he traveled north to Edinburgh. On the 29th of June, 1917, in a United Free Church of Scotland ceremony, he married Elizabeth Addison Stewart, a 21-year-old Scottish waitress. He returned to his unit in August. The unit was moving toward Belgium. What Elizabeth understood of what he had done and was returning to, whether either of them believed this was a foundation for something that would hold across the years after the war, these questions have no documentary answers. The inner life of Billy Singh is almost entirely absent from the record. The outer facts are a ceremony in Edinburgh, a return to France, and a marriage that did not survive what came after. The Battle of Polygon Wood was part of the Third Battle of Ypres, the campaign known to history as Passchendaele, a name that has become shorthand for a particular kind of industrial catastrophe conducted in conditions that defied any sane accounting of what warfare could reasonably impose on human bodies. Mustard gas had saturated the Belgian salient. The bombardments had destroyed the drainage systems that the low-lying land required to remain solid, and the shell craters filled with water and mud that could swallow men whole. The 31st Battalion moved through this terrain and participated in the assault on Polygon Wood between the 26th and 28th of September, 1917. They reached their final objective. After the objective was secured, German snipers operating from positions in the surrounding terrain were causing casualties among the men consolidating what they had just taken. The front line had been captured in the tactical sense. In the practical sense, men were still being killed by unseen shooters in positions the force could not immediately identify, while the enemy bombardment continued on the captured ground. Billy Singh volunteered. The military medal citation is unambiguous on this point. This soldier volunteered, not ordered, not assigned. In the middle of a battle in which he had already participated in the assault, while the enemy actively bombarded the position and gas had contaminated the ground and air, he proposed to take a fighting patrol out into the killing ground and find the German snipers. The citation records what followed in the compressed economy of official military language. At Polygon Wood on the 26th and 28th of September, 1917, after the capture of the final objective and notwithstanding a terrific bombardment by the enemy, this soldier volunteered to take out a fighting patrol to mop up some snipers who were causing casualties. By his dash and success in dealing with these, our front line was secured, and consolidation continued. He found them. He eliminated them. The line held. His commanding officer added one sentence that contains, in a single word, everything the military record ever said about what Billy Singh could do that other men could not. During the whole operation, the citation reads, his skill in picking out and dealing with snipers was uncanny. Not excellent. Not commendable. Uncanny, a word that means something outside the normal range of human capacity. Something that, in the observation of a trained officer writing a formal document, exceeded what could be accounted for through the ordinary categories of skill and experience. A commanding officer used that word in an official military citation. It is the most precise description of Billy Singh that any document in the historical record contains, and it carries the force of professional military judgment offered under conditions that give such judgments their full weight. His commanding officer recommended him for the Military Medal, the British Commonwealth Award for gallantry in the field, that the action had earned under the criteria applied to comparable actions. The recommendation was not approved. Instead, Billy Singh received the Belgian Croix de Guerre in early 1918, awarded for his actions at Polygon Wood. The Croix de Guerre was a foreign decoration, honorable, meaningful, and bestowed for exactly the same action the domestic recommendation described. No official explanation exists for the substitution. The military medal was what the chain of command directly responsible for the action said he deserved. The Croix de Guerre was what he received. The gap between those two things has never been formally accounted for. Patrick Bugden of the same 31st Battalion was killed at Polygon Wood on the 28th of September, 1917, the final day of the same engagement in which Singh led his patrol. Bugden was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. He and Singh were in the same unit, in the same battle, on the same days. One died and received the highest military honor the Commonwealth could bestow. One survived and received a foreign decoration in place of the domestic one his commanding officer had requested. The narrative offers no verdict on this proximity. The proximity offers its own. After Polygon Wood, Singh spent much of the war's remaining months in hospital. Gas exposure had produced respiratory damage that would not heal. The leg wound continued causing problems. On the 18th of February, 1918, a bullet struck his left shoulder, his third wound. Military policy on third woundings was clear and consistently applied. Repatriation. On the 21st of July, 1918, he departed for Australia. Nearly 4 years in the field. He was 32 years old. On the 29th of November, 1918, he was medically discharged in Brisbane. The official reason cited chest problems, the beginning of what the gas had started, and that time would finish. He returned to Proserpine. The town turned out. A citizens' band played "See the Conquering Hero Comes." The Patriotic League presented a purse of sovereigns. The community's gratitude was genuine and expressed in the ceremonies that communities know how to perform when a soldier comes home. None of it was sufficient for what followed. The soldier settlement scheme provided returned veterans with farming land, a government program designed to give the men who had fought something to build with. The scheme was persistently criticized for delivering inadequate land, insufficient capital, and almost no preparation for men whose years had been spent doing something entirely unrelated to farming. Singh's settlement failed. He tried the Maiclair goldfields near Claremont, where the gold had drawn his father 60 years earlier. The ground produced nothing. Elizabeth did not come from Edinburgh. Recent research indicates she remained in Scotland, where she had children by other men. Whatever the Edinburgh ceremony had meant to either of them, the distance and the years had dissolved it before it assembled into anything durable. The physical diminishment was slow and steady. The chest damage from the gas grew worse across the 1920s and 30s. He drank heavily, as the historical record notes without elaboration. The accumulated wounds, the leg, the shoulder, the gas in his lungs, had produced a chronic condition that did not respond to the treatments available to a man with limited resources in country Queensland between the wars. He had been a crack shot, a professional bushman, a man whose patience and precision had drawn the personal attention of a general officer and been reported to a cabinet minister as the benchmark by which an army should be measured. He was now working as a laborer, unable to sustain the farm, or the mine, or the marriage that might have shaped the years after the war differently. In 1942, he moved to Brisbane to be near his surviving sister Beatrice. He took a room at 304 Montague Road, West End. On the 19th of May, 1943, his aorta ruptured. He died alone in his room. The possessions recorded at the time: a miner's hut worth approximately £20 on the My Clare claim, 5 shillings in the room, £6 owed in wages. His Distinguished Conduct Medal was not there. The Belgian Croix de Guerre was not there. The mentions in dispatches from 2 generals were not there. The medals were somewhere. They were not with him. Billy Singh was buried at Lutwyche Cemetery in Brisbane. His grave was not marked. For 50 years, from 1943 to 1993, the grave of the man whom the Anzac Corps commander had called the standard by which an army should measure itself, sat in that cemetery without a stone. Not lost. Simply not marked. A lost grave is a logistical failure. An unmarked grave is a decision. In 1993, a local journalist investigated his story. The attention this generated prompted action from the RSL and community advocates. A marker was placed on the grave. A plaque was placed at the boarding house site at 304 Montague Road, a commercial building by then, the original structure long gone. Don Cameron, a former Liberal Member of Parliament for Queensland, had tracked down the story independently, found where Singh had died, and paid for both plaques himself. 2 years later, in 1995, a statue was erected at Hood's Lagoon in Claremont, the town where John Singh had stayed when other Chinese miners moved on, where Billy had learned to shoot piglet tails off at 25 paces, the hometown reclaiming what it had not known it possessed. In 2008, John Hamilton published Gallipoli Sniper, The Life of Billy Singh, through Pan Macmillan in Sydney, the first major biography, assembled from fragments of military records, official documents, and the testimonies of those who had preserved pieces of the story across the decades of silence. The book forced a reckoning with a life the country had not been particularly eager to examine. The reckoning was imperfect in ways that made its own point. A television miniseries, The Legend of Billy Singh, was in post-production in 2010. Both Singh and his father, John, the man from Shanghai who had stayed in Claremont when everyone else moved on, were portrayed by actors of European descent. The director's explanation was that he could not find a 60-year-old Chinese actor to play John Singh. Former Senator Bill O'Chee, whose own father was Chinese and mother Irish-Australian, said, "We will now have people growing up thinking Billy Singh was white. But we are jealous of his memory." Cameron, who had paid for the commemorative plaques with his own money, called it tragically wrong. John Hamilton, the biographer, stated he had never been contacted by the filmmakers. The controversy revealed the rediscovery completing the pattern of the life, the country that could not quite claim a man during it, the film industry that could not accurately portray him when it tried, and the community that identified with a fury that had nowhere adequate to go, exactly what both failures amounted to. On the 19th of May, 2015, the 72nd anniversary of his death, a formal memorial service was held at Lutwyche Cemetery. Major General Darrell Low Choi addressed those present and spoke of acknowledging and paying tribute to the bloke from the Queensland bush who enlisted against the odds, to go off to war, to serve his country, to distinguish himself on the battlefield on numerous occasions. The phrase enlisted against the odds contains the 1909 Defense Act in 6 words. The phrase distinguish himself on the battlefield contains the 201 officially verified kills, the word uncanny in a formal citation, and the Distinguished Conduct Medal awarded for conspicuous gallantry in 3. These are the compressions that official language performs when the full version of what it needs to say would be uncomfortable to say plainly. His medals are now on display at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, the institution that should have been the custodian of his story from the beginning. They were missing from his room when he died. Where they were in the intervening years is not documented in any source that has been made public. They are behind glass in Canberra now, which is where they belong. That this required recovery, rather than simply being the state of things from the beginning, is itself part of the accounting. The boarding house at 304 Montague Road is not there anymore. A commercial building stands on the site. The plaque is there, placed by a man who found the story in a newspaper and was moved enough to pay for the permanent acknowledgement that the institutions responsible for it hadn't provided. At Lutwisha Cemetery, the stone reads, in part, that his incredible accuracy contributed greatly to the preservation of the lives of those with whom he served during a war always remembered for countless acts of valor and tragic carnage. The 5 shillings in the room at Montague Road, the £6 owed, General Birdwood taking a turn at the spotter's telescope so he could watch one trooper's marksmanship firsthand, and telling Lord Kitchener afterward what he had seen. The word uncanny in a formal military citation, placed there by a commanding officer who chose his words with the care that formal documents require. The military medal recommendation that became a Belgian decoration without explanation. The grave that went unmarked for 50 years. The film that cast white actors as a Chinese-Australian man and his Chinese father. Each of these facts belongs to the same account. The distance between the word uncanny and the 5 shillings is the distance in which Billy Singh's real history is written, not the history of what he could do, which the Army documented carefully and verified with independent observers, but the history of what the country that used that capacity was prepared to acknowledge he had given it, in life and after. William Edward Singh, the farm boy from Claremont, the son of John Singh from Shanghai and Mary Ann Pugh from Staffordshire. The trooper whom the 1909 Defense Act said should not be there. Who was there anyway? Who was there from October of 1914 to July of 1918, across Gallipoli and the Western Front, and Polygon Wood in the Belgian mud, and who killed more enemy soldiers with a single standard-issue rifle than almost any other man the Australian Imperial Force sent to fight? Who died in West End with 5 shillings and no medals? Who lay in an unmarked grave for 50 years in a country that builds monuments to its war dead and had not, in those 50 years, placed a stone? If you believe that name deserves more than it received, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand what a century of industrial warfare actually did to the men who survived it, and what the countries that sent them did with those men afterward, watch this next.